When we talk about narcissism, one of the most important things to remember is this: narcissism is not one size fits all. Different narcissists carry different styles, and each leaves behind a very particular kind of emotional scar. When most people hear the word narcissist, a very specific image usually comes to mind: someone loud, arrogant, and constantly fishing for compliments. And while that stereotype isn't entirely wrong, it's only one piece of a much larger picture. Narcissism is not a single mold. It exists on a spectrum, and different types of narcissists show up in very different ways. That's important to understand because the kind of narcissist you encounter often shapes the kind of emotional impact you'll carry with you afterward. Think of it like this: narcissism is less about one exact personality and more about a fragile psychological foundation. At its core, narcissism is built around insecurity and a shaky sense of self-worth. But the way each narcissist manages that insecurity varies, and that's why the outward behaviors look so different. For some, the strategy is to puff themselves up, constantly bragging, demanding attention, and dismissing others. For others, the strategy is to collapse inward, showing up as victimhood or hypersensitivity that draws people in with sympathy. And then there are those who combine narcissism with cruelty, aggression, or even exploitation. Each type has its own style, its own ways of relating to the world, and ultimately its own ways of harming the people closest to them. Why does this matter? Because the scars survivors carry don't come out of nowhere. They are tied directly to the type of narcissism they were exposed to. For example, if someone has been in a relationship with a grandiose narcissist, they often leave feeling small, overlooked, and constantly second-guessing themselves. If they've been entangled with a vulnerable narcissist, they might leave feeling like they can't relax around people, always scanning for cues that they've upset someone. If it's been a malignant narcissist, the scars may look like deep mistrust, fear, and even trauma responses that linger for years. And if the narcissist was the so-called communal type, the one who appears charitable and self-sacrificing, the person may leave with profound guilt and a sense that their needs are selfish or unworthy. So, when we talk about understanding the spectrum of narcissism, it's not about labeling people just for the sake of having categories. It's about mapping the impact. Survivors often ask themselves, why do I feel this way? Why do I carry this doubt, this fear, this guilt? Recognizing the type of narcissism you've dealt with can offer clarity. It's not that you're weak or flawed, it's that you were in a relationship with someone whose way of navigating the world systematically undermined your sense of self. Another reason this spectrum matters is that it helps us drop the idea that all narcissists are obvious. Not all of them are loud or showy. Some are quiet, introverted, even shy seeming. Some cloak themselves in generosity or spirituality. And because of that, many people end up blindsided. They think, this can't be narcissism. This person doesn't fit the stereotype. But narcissism isn't about appearances. It's about patterns of behavior, entitlement, lack of empathy, exploitation, and the inability to handle accountability. Those core traits can hide under very different masks. Understanding this makes a huge difference for healing. If you know that you were dealing with someone who weaponized guilt, then the lingering shame you feel makes sense. If you realize you were with someone who constantly needed to be the smartest or most important person in the room, then the self-doubt you carry is not random. It's a scar left by repeated invalidation. When you can connect the dots between type and impact, you start to see yourself not as broken, but as someone who adapted to survive in a toxic environment. The spectrum of narcissism also reminds us of one more crucial truth: these relationships are not accidents. People don't usually walk away from narcissistic relationships untouched because the very foundation of narcissism is relational harm. It's a personality style that feeds on control, validation, and power at the expense of others. So when you feel the weight of those scars, whether it's mistrust, guilt, fear, or self-doubt, it isn't a sign that you're weak. It's a sign that you were exposed to a psychological dynamic that was designed to keep you in that place. At the end of the day, the spectrum of narcissism teaches us that different types leave different wounds. That knowledge is the first step toward healing because it gives language to experiences that otherwise feel confusing and isolating. When you can name it, you can begin to separate yourself from it. You can start to see that what you're carrying is not who you are. It's what was done to you. And with that clarity comes the possibility of rewriting the story, reclaiming your voice, and slowly, piece by piece, healing the scars that were left behind. When we look more closely at narcissism, it becomes clear that there isn't just one kind of narcissist. The way narcissistic traits show up in someone's life can differ dramatically, and because of that, the impact they have on the people around them also looks very different. Understanding these types is important because it allows survivors to connect their emotional scares to the dynamics they were actually exposed to, rather than blaming themselves for how they feel. One of the most recognizable is the grandiose narcissist. This is often the classic image people have when they think of narcissism: loud, arrogant, and constantly positioning themselves as the most important person in the room. They thrive on admiration, and they often dismiss or minimize anyone else's experiences. The impact of being around a grandiose narcissist is often an erosion of self-esteem. Over time, you can start to feel invisible or insignificant because your thoughts and feelings are consistently overshadowed by theirs. The emotional scar left behind here is doubt about your own worth, feeling like no matter what you accomplish, it will never be good enough to matter. Then there is the vulnerable narcissist, which can be much harder to recognize. They don't look inflated or arrogant. Instead, they come across as fragile, sensitive, or perpetually victimized. Their strategy is to draw others in through guilt or pity. At first, it might feel like you're needed in a meaningful way, but soon it becomes clear that the relationship is one-sided. You find yourself constantly managing their moods, avoiding conflict, or silencing your own needs so you don't upset them. The scar that develops here is hypervigilance, a kind of emotional scanning where you're always on alert, anticipating reactions and tiptoeing to keep the peace. Survivors often leave these relationships feeling like they are too much, or that expressing needs is selfish, because they've been conditioned to believe their role is to protect someone else's emotional fragility. The malignant narcissist is another variation, and this one tends to leave the deepest and often the most lasting harm. This type is not just entitled or self-absorbed. They can also be aggressive, manipulative, and at times outright cruel. They don't just dismiss or guilt trip. You may find them actively undermining, intimidating, or controlling you. Being in a relationship with a malignant narcissist can feel like living in a psychological war zone. The scars they leave behind are fear and mistrust. Long after the relationship ends, many survivors describe feeling unsafe in the world, suspicious of people's motives, and afraid that if they let their guard down, they'll be harmed again. This kind of imprint can make forming new relationships incredibly difficult because the nervous system remains wired to expect danger. And then there is the communal narcissist, who presents as the helper, the rescuer, or the selfless giver. On the surface, they appear kind and altruistic. They may be active in their community, generous with their time, or eager to step in when someone needs assistance. But beneath this mask of generosity lies the same entitlement and lack of empathy. Their giving isn't free, it's transactional. They expect recognition, control, or loyalty in return. Survivors of communal narcissists often carry scars of guilt and shame. They have been made to feel ungrateful or selfish if they ever question the help they received. Over time, this creates an internalized belief that asking for anything or setting boundaries is wrong. The shame runs deep, leaving people hesitant to trust their own needs or even to accept healthy support from others in the future. What's striking across these types is that while the behaviors differ, the result is always some form of harm to the people around them. Narcissists, regardless of type, are unable to provide consistent empathy or validation. Instead, their relationships revolve around meeting their own needs, whether that's through attention, pity, control, or recognition. And the people closest to them end up carrying emotional burdens that don't belong to them, burdens like doubt, fear, guilt, or vigilance. Recognizing the different types of narcissists matters because it helps survivors put words to their pain. If you've lived with a grandiose narcissist, that lingering sense of invisibility makes sense. If you've been tied to a vulnerable narcissist, the habit of walking on eggshells has an explanation. If you've been targeted by a malignant narcissist, the fear and mistrust you carry are not random. They are the imprint of a threatening dynamic. And if you've dealt with a communal narcissist, the guilt you feel every time you think about your needs is a predictable outcome of that experience. Understanding these types and their impacts doesn't erase the scars, but it provides clarity. And clarity is powerful. It allows survivors to shift their perspective from self-blame to recognition. This is not who I am. It's what I was conditioned to feel. With that awareness, healing becomes possible. You can begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that were minimized, silenced, or shamed, and little by little, rebuild a sense of safety and self-trust. When people leave relationships with narcissists, the pain doesn't end when the relationship ends. What lingers are the scars, emotional imprints that stay in the body, mind, and nervous system long after the narcissist is gone. These scars aren't always visible, and that's part of what makes them so difficult. On the outside, life may look fine, but inside, survivors often carry fear, doubt, and shame that trace directly back to the relationship. One of the most common scars is self-doubt. When someone has lived with a narcissist, especially a grandiose one, they've often had their reality questioned repeatedly. Maybe they were told their feelings were overreactions, their accomplishments didn't matter, or their perspective was wrong. Over time, this repeated invalidation chips away at confidence. Even after the relationship ends, survivors may second-guess themselves in everyday situations. Did I say the wrong thing? Am I imagining this? Maybe I'm the problem. This kind of chronic self-doubt can make simple decisions feel overwhelming because the scar has taught the survivor that their judgment cannot be trusted. Another scar is hypervigilance. This is particularly common for those who've been close to vulnerable narcissists. In those relationships, survivors often had to tiptoe around moods, carefully manage conversations, or constantly adjust themselves to avoid triggering anger, sulking, or defensiveness. The nervous system learns to stay on guard. Even years later, survivors may find themselves scanning rooms, monitoring tone of voice, or overthinking texts, always anticipating what might go wrong. This isn't paranoia, it's the residue of conditioning. The body learned that safety depended on predicting and managing someone else's emotional volatility. Fear and mistrust are also powerful scars, especially for those who dealt with malignant narcissists. When cruelty, manipulation, or intimidation were part of the relationship, the message that gets lodged deep inside is, people are dangerous. Vulnerability is unsafe. Survivors may find themselves flinching at conflict, withdrawing from intimacy, or assuming that new people in their lives will eventually hurt them. It isn't just a cognitive belief, it becomes a lived physical response. The nervous system stays braced for betrayal or harm, even when there's no immediate threat. This makes forming healthy connections difficult, because the scar itself keeps pulling the survivor back into a protective posture. Shame is another deeply rooted scar, often left behind by communal narcissists. These are the people who seemed selfless or giving, but who weaponize generosity. Survivors are left with the idea that their needs are selfish or ungrateful. Even years later, they may struggle to ask for help, to set boundaries, or even to say no, because the scar tells them they are wrong for wanting anything at all. This shame can be paralyzing, quietly eating away at self-worth and making it harder to recognize what healthy relationships should actually look like. What's important to understand is that these scars don't appear out of thin air. They are the logical outcome of repeated emotional experiences. If someone is constantly dismissed, they learn to doubt themselves. If someone is consistently forced to manage another person's emotions, they learn to stay hyper alert. If they are intimidated or threatened, fear becomes a survival mechanism. And if they are made to feel guilty for their needs, shame embeds itself into their sense of identity. These are not random personality traits. They are the aftereffects of a specific kind of relationship. The challenge is that scars can shape how survivors see themselves long after the narcissist is gone. Someone who doubts themselves may hold back from pursuing goals. Someone who is hypervigilant may exhaust themselves trying to control every situation. Someone who carries fear may isolate, and someone who carries shame may settle for less than they deserve. The scars become invisible barriers, limiting how survivors show up in their own lives. But here's the crucial piece. Scars are not signs of weakness. They are signs of survival. They are evidence of what someone had to adapt to in order to get through. Self-doubt, vigilance, fear, and shame may be painful, but they also served a purpose at one point. They kept the survivor connected, safe, or protected in a very unsafe relationship. Recognizing this can be the first step toward healing. Instead of judging themselves for still carrying these imprints, survivors can begin to understand them as predictable outcomes of what they endured. And once the scars are named, healing becomes possible. Therapy, self-reflection, supportive communities, and boundary work can all help loosen the grip of these old wounds. Survivors can relearn trust in their own judgment, practice calming a alert nervous system, test safe vulnerability with trustworthy people, and replace shame with self-compassion. The scars may never fully disappear, but they can become reminders of strength rather than evidence of damage. In the end, the emotional scars left by narcissists are varied, but they all point to the same truth: these relationships change people. They leave behind doubt, vigilance, fear, and shame, but they also leave behind resilience. Survivors who recognize their scars can begin to write a new story, one where the wounds no longer dictate their future, but instead serve as reminders of how deeply they have endured and how powerfully they can heal. When someone has been through a relationship with a narcissist, it is very common to be left with a swirl of confusion, shame, and unanswered questions. Many survivors spend months or even years wondering what went wrong, replaying conversations, and blaming themselves for not seeing the signs sooner. This is why awareness is such a critical first step. Awareness shifts the focus from self-blame to understanding the patterns of narcissism and the impact those patterns leave behind. It gives language to what felt unspeakable, and with language comes power. Awareness begins with recognizing that what happened was not just difficult relationship or bad luck. It was the result of being entangled with someone who lacked empathy, who needed control, or who could only function in a dynamic where they remained on top and others remained diminished. When you understand that the feelings you carry, whether it's doubt, fear, guilt, or shame, stop feeling like personal flaws and start making sense as natural responses to the situation. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" awareness allows you to ask, "What happened to me?" That shift changes everything because it reframes the scars as consequences of trauma, not defects of character. Healing, however, is not instant, and it's rarely linear. Once survivors understand the type of narcissist they were dealing with and the scars left behind, the work becomes learning how to untangle from those scars. For someone carrying chronic self-doubt, this might mean slowly practicing trusting their own decisions again, starting small and building confidence piece by piece. For someone struggling with hypervigilance, healing might involve calming the nervous system through mindfulness, grounding techniques, or therapeutic support so the body can learn that safety is possible again. For those who carry fear, the process may involve carefully testing trust in new relationships, paying close attention to how people show up, and reminding themselves that not everyone operates like the narcissist did. And for survivors weighed down by shame, healing often begins with self-compassion, challenging the old belief that their needs were selfish and learning that their needs are valid, human, and worthy of respect. Another crucial part of healing is boundaries. Narcissistic relationships thrive on blurred or non-existent boundaries. Survivors are often trained to give more than they receive, to tolerate disrespect, and to silence themselves in order to keep the peace. Rebuilding boundaries means reclaiming the right to say no, to walk away from toxicity, and to prioritize one's own well-being without apology. At first, setting boundaries can feel terrifying or even wrong because it goes directly against the conditioning the narcissist instilled. But over time, boundaries become not only a shield, but also a way of communicating self-respect to the world. Healing also requires connection, but it has to be the right kind of connection. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse feel isolated, either because the narcissist cut them off from support systems or because they are ashamed of their experiences. Reaching out to trusted friends, to therapists, to support groups can be transformative. Safe, empathic relationships act as corrective experiences, slowly teaching the nervous system that trust, respect, and care are real and attainable. These connections don't erase the scars, but they help soften them, providing a new blueprint for what relationships can feel like. Perhaps one of the most empowering aspects of awareness and healing is reclaiming narrative. Narcissists often rewrite history, gaslight, and distort events to protect their own image. Survivors are left confused about what actually happened, sometimes even doubting their memory of events. Part of healing is telling the story honestly, naming the manipulation, acknowledging the harm, and recognizing the resilience it took to endure. Reclaiming narrative isn't about staying stuck in the past, it's about anchoring in truth, so that the past no longer has the power to distort the present. It is also worth remembering that healing is not about erasing scars or returning to who you were before the narcissist. That version of you may not exist anymore, and that's okay. Healing is about becoming someone new, someone who carries wisdom about red flags, who knows the value of boundaries, and who has cultivated strength in the face of deep pain. The scars may remain, but they become reminders of survival rather than permanent wounds. The path toward awareness and healing is long and sometimes exhausting, but it is possible. Survivors can move from confusion to clarity, from shame to self-respect, from fear to cautious trust. The very qualities that were targeted, empathy, compassion, sensitivity, are the same qualities that make healing possible because they allow survivors to extend understanding to themselves. Over time, the grip of the narcissist loosens, and what remains is not just the memory of harm, but the strength of having made it through. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it gives survivors the power to step into the future with more clarity, resilience, and hope than they may have thought possible.